Roadrunner was a music magazine that myself and a colleague, Stuart Coupe, founded in Adelaide in 1978. It ran for 5 years. It was always a labour of love. It was never profitable. It relied on the passion of its contributors and its readers for the music of the time. So it was I guess its genesis was a punk fanzine that Stuart and I did at the end of 1977. And although I don't think fanzine is quite the description of the magazine. I think it outgrew that kind of label. The core principles of a fanzine, that it's written by people who are in love with what they're writing about, I think that stayed with the magazine right through its lifespan.
So why did you start Roadrunner up?
I'd come back from the UK. I'd spent 2.5 years in the UK in the mid 70s, and the whole punk rock new wave thing went off while I was there. I found it very exciting. I found the music very exciting. I didn't find England particularly exciting. It was a bit of a depressed place, which prompted the kind of musical reaction. Anyway, after 2.5 years, I thought, oh, look, I'll go back to Australia. But I came back very enthusiastic about this music that I'd been exposed to. And I went around to a lot of my friends from university who looked at me quite quizzically and, like, Donald's gone a bit strange. But one of them introduced me to Stuart, and we shared this feeling for the music. And one of the key factors or elements of the punk new wave thing was the slogan, do it yourself. So whether it be start a band or design a record cover or write a review or put something out, it was very much a sort of do it yourself philosophy. So we put that into practice, did the punk fanzine. We'd found a sort of small group of people who were similar views, and then we enjoyed that, and we contacted some of the sort of music industry people in Adelaide and said, oh, look, we'd like to do this magazine. We'll cover Adelaide bands and we'll cover this new music, and what do you think? So they got on board, helped us with advertising and setting things up. And Stuart knew the printer at Flinders University, so he'd been working on the university magazine there, Empire Times. So we sort of gradually put the elements together that enabled us to produce a magazine.
And it eventually went national. Can you talk a little bit about being national? And
sure, yeah. So after the first year, so it was a bit of an editorial collective that first year in Adelaide. It was myself, Stuart. There was a guy called Alan Coupe, who was the layout artist. He was also at Flinders. Alex Elert, who was a housemate of Stuart's. And Bruce Milne and Clinton Walker they'd done fanzines in Melbourne. They came over from Melbourne and sort of joined in. And so it was all pretty, it was a collective. It was sort of, we had vaguely kind of socialist principles about no one being the boss, everyone having a say. But after the end of the first year, everyone else pretty much said, oh, well, that was fun, and walked away. I was working in the Department of Social Security in the unemployment benefits section, and this magazine seemed a much more exciting prospect than continuing working in the Dole office. So at the end of the first year, a new group of people coalesced around the idea that we would look at how would we take a magazine national out of Adelaide, which there's very few precedents actually. So anyway, we arranged distribution in particularly New South Wales and Victoria. we had limited distribution in Queensland, Western Australia, and we grew. We had more exposure, more readership. We started getting more advertising. It got gradually more professional.
Tell us about the content, because the content's both local, national and international.
Pardon me. That's right. All the two main rivals, I guess, to Roadrunner at the time were Ram and Duke, and they both had arrangements with overseas publishers to republish articles from particularly the British music press. We never had that, so everything in the magazine was original. But we quickly established a sort of network of correspondence, both within Australia, and a key one was Keith Shadwick in London. Keith had been a musician and a poet in Melbourne. He was in bands like the Bleeding Hearts and the High Rise Bombers with Paul Kelly and Martin Armiger. In mid-78, he relocated to London. I knew, we'd kind of met through mutual friends. And he became our London editor and, very much finger on the pulse in London. And that was, a very important contributor in terms of covering the British scene. A little later, Kerry Phillips, who'd been an announcer at Double J in Sydney, moved to New York, and she became a New York correspondent. So we kind of had the two main music centres, or two of the main music centres, covered by Australians in place, giving an Australian perspective on what was going on overseas. So as well as obviously the local coverage, and the record companies were very diligent about providing us with phone interviews with overseas artists who were coming to tour and that kind of thing.
Can you tell us about the success or otherwise of the magazine?
Well, I guess the main success from my point of view is that it kept going for so long. So 5 years, it's a pretty good innings. 48 issues. As I say, we never had any financial backing, so we relied on the goodwill of our printer, Bridge Press in Murray Bridge, regional South Australia, and we ran up a debt with them, and it got to the point where we would sort of pay for an issue in advance and knock a bit off the bill. And that arrangement continued probably for 3 or 4 years. And look, they were glad of the work, and they were getting paid for the work that they did. We were reducing the debt, so we certainly, that was a key factor in enabling the magazine to continue. In terms of sales figures, I think the maximum sale of any issue was about 6,500 copies. Yep. I don't think it ever fell below 3 once we went national, so it was in that sort of 3 to 6 sales through news agents. We never signed up to the Audit Bureau of Circulation, so we never had official figures or anything like that. But if you set a rough rule of thumb of 5 people read every issue, which given the people who are buying it and reading it's probably not over generous. That's 20 to 30,000 readers. And the people who bought it, the readership were very loyal. In years since, when I mentioned that I was publisher of Roadrunner, people invariably said, "Oh, great magazine! Oh, I loved it." So it's that gives you a bit of a warm and fuzzy feeling, I suppose.
What were some of your favourite moments in compiling
One moment that really does stick out was when when John Lennon was assassinated. So we were me and the production team were, laying an issue out. So we were right on print deadline, and the news came through, and we just kind of stopped what we were doing and just talked, for a couple of hours. Just, oh my God, And then I went home that evening and I wrote an obituary, which I dropped off to the typesetter the next morning. We got it back later that day, laid it out, took the issue up to Murray Bridge, and we were on the street sort of, I think, like 3 days after it happened. So, I mean, with a monthly magazine, it's very rare that you're kind of on the cusp of news, but with that issue we were, and and also the cover. We were limited by financial reasons to sort of usually to spot colour. We graduated to full colour kind of later on. The magazines existed, but this cover I actually think is a bit of a work of art because it's a very subtle red and yellow spot colour on black, and so but it's the way it's come out. I just think it's almost like that old kind of sepia tone pictures that you get from the early part of the 20th century. Anyway, that was certainly a memorable moment.
What about interviews?
Interviews, goodness me. If I had $1 for every one I've done, I'd still be rich. Look, most Australian bands would come to Adelaide, so I would get to interview them face to face, and that's always better than over the phone. And I would come up to Sydney occasionally and go to Melbourne occasionally and do some interviews. I remember interviewing Don Walker from Cold Chisel up in Sydney one time, and he was recording the soundtrack to a movie called Freedom. So it's a solo project, but he was holed up in Paradise Studios in Woolloomooloo, and he said, come after midnight, it'll sort of be, we'll done most of the work then. So, I rolled up at midnight and spent, 3 or 4 hours just chatting with him. We played a game of chess. There was sort of, music happening in the back. So I remember that was unusual. It was unusual to kind of be in the studio with bands in this period. It was, usually in the Roadrunner office or over the phone.
What about gigs and performances?
Yeah, once again, most of the top Australian bands came to Adelaide. Adelaide was on the circuit. Adelaide, as is the case with Sydney and Melbourne, not so much Brisbane because you have the Joe Peterson regime that wasn't particularly fond of rock and roll at the time. Perth was pretty good live too. Adelaide had a really good, vibrant live scene that not only accommodated the big interstate bands coming in. The interstate bands would come in and usually do 4 nights, sometimes 5 nights. But the local Adelaide bands also had venues that they played, and sometimes they supported the bigger bands as well. So it was actually quite a creative Adelaide, local Adelaide scene, live scene, and that was boosted when the community radio station 5MMM started there. They were very much a progressive music station and supported local bands with demos. They played demos on air, which would encourage people to go and see. And we had the big international bands come through Adelaide as well, obviously. And it was a very, I think it really was the glory days of Australian pub rock from sort of 78 through to 83. After 83, I was in Sydney then, the number of venues just seemed to gradually decrease. I think pokies were a factor, so pubs put in pokies instead of live music. So the magazine really did kind of coincide with that golden period of live music in Australia.
So what do you see as the real value of a digitisation project making this available to current generation students, researchers, etc.?
As I said, I wrote a history of the magazine to accompany the digitisation project, and one of the things I said there, you know, for everyone who was there and wants to remember, and for those who weren't there and would like to find out what it was all about. So I think the period that the magazine covers and the music scene that the magazine covers was possibly the most creative period in Australian music. I think you could make that argument. The number of bands and artists who emerged in that period, you know, I could run through a list, you know, as long as my arm. And many of them went on to international success. In Excess, Men at Work, Midnight Oil, Crowded House, Divinals, just to name 5. And Roadrunner covered them all in their kind of early periods when they first started out. I think, again, if I pick up a cover, the very first cover of In Excess was Roadrunner. And, you know, later when I was doing Countdown magazine, Chris Murphy, the band's manager, said, oh, you know, I always remember that cover, Donald, you know, he's the very first cover. I think Sunny Boys were another who, we gave them the first cover, and I remember that cover being in a frame in the Mushroom Records office, you know, so we tried to be, the magazine tried to be sort of on the cutting edge of the new bands coming through. So what would somebody, a researcher today or a young researcher get out of the magazine? I guess just a sense of the times and a sense of you know, what musicians were thinking about in their songwriting and their performance. I think you'd certainly get that, because a lot of the interviews were just question answer, you know, and long interviews as well. So it's kind of like get the tape recorder running, have the conversation, transcribe the conversation, put it in the magazine. So it was very, in many cases, very unfiltered. And so you I think, hear the performer or the artist's voice quite clearly.